The Weight of Race, on Sabrina Strings' Fearing the Black Body. Sabrina Strings' Fearing the Black Body. The Racial Origins of Fatphobia, 2019, opens with a claim designed to unsettle a belief most readers hold as simple biomedical fact, that the modern preference for thinness and the corresponding stigma attached to fatness is not primarily a product of health science at all. It is, Strings argues, a racial ideology, one that emerged over centuries of transatlantic history to mark thinness as a sign of Anglo-Saxon, Protestant self-discipline and racial superiority, and fatness as a sign of black excess, unrestrained appetite, and racial inferiority, and that this ideology was fully in place well before 20th century medicine began measuring body size and calling the result health science. The core argument Strings, a sociologist, builds her case through a long historical arc rather than a single moment of origin. She traces European Enlightenment-era racial science, including its fascination with and exploitation of Sarah Baartman, the South African woman displayed publicly and clinically examined in early 19th century Europe under the label Hottentot Venus, as part of a broader project that used black women's bodies, including their size and shape, as evidence of racial difference and inferiority relative to an idealized white European form. She connects this to the specifically American context of slavery, in which distinctions in body size and comportment were mobilized by pro-slavery writers and slaveholders to differentiate enslaved black women, cast as large, excessive, and driven by uncontrolled appetite, from white women, cast as delicate, restrained, and civilized. A distinction, Strings argues, served directly to justify the racial hierarchy slavery depended on. The book's second major strand traces the rise of a specifically Protestant ideology of bodily self-discipline in 19th century America, associated with figures like health reformer Sylvester Graham, in which thinness and appetite control became markers of moral virtue, religious devotion, and crucially, in Strings' account, racial and national fitness for self-government. At a moment when American Protestant elites were also anxious about immigration, race, and national character. Strings argues these two strands, racial science's construction of black bodies as excessive and Protestant moral culture's valorization of restraint, fused over the following century into a single ideology in which body size became a primary, visible marker of racial and moral hierarchy. By the time 20th century medicine began developing tools like the body mass index and framing fatness as a medical pathology, Strings argues it was inheriting and encoding a racialized moral judgment under the cover of neutral scientific measurement, obscuring, rather than discovering, the ideology's actual origins. What the book gets right. The book's central intervention, insisting that the history of anti-fatness be read through race and empire, rather than treated as a self-evident matter of health science that acquired racial baggage only incidentally or recently, has been genuinely field-shaping within fat studies, critical race theory, and the sociology of health. Strings assembles an unusually wide interdisciplinary archive, moving between art history, her readings of period portraiture and its treatment of the female body, the history of racial science, religious history, and the history of medicine, to show continuity across domains that are usually studied separately. This makes visible a through line from Enlightenment racial taxonomy through antebellum pro-slavery ideology through Victorian Protestant body culture to 20th century medical obesity discourse that had not previously been assembled into a single, sustained historical argument. The book also does important work complicating the presumed neutrality of contemporary public health discourse around weight, by showing that categories like the BMI and the broader medical and cultural alarm around an obesity epidemic, disproportionately associated with Black communities in contemporary discourse, did not emerge from a value-free scientific process, but inherited assumptions about which bodies count as disciplined, healthy, and normative that were laid down by explicitly racial ideology generations earlier. This reframing has proven influential well beyond academic sociology, shaping public conversation about weight stigma, medical bias, and the cultural politics of health more broadly. Where the argument strains. The book's reception, while substantial and influential, has generated meaningful pushback from historians, public health scholars, and reviewers working in adjacent fields. The monocausal racial origin story may understate other contributing traditions. Critics have noted that ideals of bodily restraint, asceticism, and suspicion of excess appetite have deep roots in Western religious and philosophical traditions that predate and exist independently of the specific racial ideologies Strings foregrounds, including medieval Christian traditions of fasting and bodily discipline and class-based European distinctions between aristocratic slenderness and peasant corpulence that carried their own non-racial moral valence for centuries before the periods Strings examines in depth. This does not refute Strings's claim that racial ideology became a decisive and specifically American vector for anti-fatness, but it complicates the framing of fatphobia's origins as singularly racial, rather than as a racial ideology that fused with and redirected older and partly independent traditions of moralized body discipline. The art historical and symbolic readings invite the usual risks of interpretive overreach. Strings's method depends substantially on reading period paintings, illustrations, and texts for symbolic meaning about racialized body ideals, a method that, as with any interpretive art history, carries an inherent risk of finding confirming patterns in ambiguous visual material. Some reviewers have suggested that individual readings, while suggestive, sometimes carry more interpretive weight in the book's overall argument than the visual evidence alone can fully bear without additional corroborating textual evidence. The book's geographic and cultural frame is narrower than its most sweeping claims sometimes imply. Fearing the Black Body focuses predominantly on transatlantic and American history, but body size ideals have varied enormously across other cultures and periods, including African societies with their own, sometimes very different, valorizations of larger body size. In ways the book engages only briefly. Critics have noted that a fuller cross-cultural account would need to grapple more directly with this variation to fully support claims about fatphobia's origins as such, rather than specifically the origins of the particular Anglo-American and transatlantic ideology the book traces in most depth. Some public health reviewers have wanted a clearer line between critiquing bias and dismissing health science altogether. Strings's argument that the medicalization of body weight inherited racial bias is a claim about the history and cultural construction of categories like the BMI, not, as she has clarified in interviews and elsewhere, a claim that body weight has no relationship to health outcomes at all. But some public health scholars reviewing the book have argued it would benefit from a more explicit and sustained distinction between these two claims within the text itself, since the rhetorical force of the historical argument can, without that distinction clearly maintained throughout, be read by some audiences as license to dismiss legitimate contemporary health science along with its racially biased history. Why the book still matters. These qualifications refine rather than undercut the book's central achievement. which is to have demonstrated with substantial and carefully assembled historical evidence that a cultural attitude widely assumed to be a simple matter of updated medical consensus has a documented genealogy running through slavery, racial science, and Protestant moral culture. A genealogy that shaped and continues to shape how bodies are read, judged, and medically evaluated along racial lines today. Fearing the black body has become an essential reference point for anyone examining the intersection of race, gender, and body politics, precisely because it insists that the history of an idea as seemingly natural as thin is healthy, fat is not, cannot be separated from the history of who that idea was built to elevate and who it was built to condemn.